States. At the moment, I'm the interim director of the Hispanic Coalition for Higher Education in San Francisco. As I mentioned just a little while ago, one of our panelists, Professor Scott, will not be with us today because his father died earlier today. So we will deal with the issues that are before us, and we have a very distinguished panel. What I plan to do is introduce each of them very briefly, and then we will begin the conversation by having first Professor Oakes on my far left begin, and then Professor Gandara on my right, and then Professor Ling-Chi Wong will finish up, and then we will open it to questions. And the panel will probably have questions for each other, and if they don't, I'll certainly ask them questions for you. So we should have a very lively discussion. Don't be surprised if during the presentations of my distinguished colleagues, I get up and walk around the room and take photographs. Kind of my hobby, okay? So if I catch you taking a drink of water or putting a piece of cake in your mouth, don't worry, they're only for my use. Bruce Hamlet from New Mexico knows otherwise, I suspect. Let me begin by introducing on my far left Professor Jeannie Oakes from UCLA. She has an enormously rich pedigree, is someone who has done outstanding work in the last 10 years, because she really got started when she was about 19. Isn't that right? Mm-hmm. Okay. She has become nationally recognized as a specialist in tracking and ability grouping, an equal distribution of resources and opportunities for education, and she works in a variety of activities to make what I call substantial change in encouraging access to higher education for underserved groups and communities. Her research has been impeccable, and she is frequently called upon to speak at functions like this, and is also called upon extensively by groups like the University of California to look into outreach activities. On her right is Professor Ling-Chi Wong from the University of California at Berkeley. Ling-Chi is probably one of the most intriguing blendings of a scholar and a political activist. He is someone who believes in that very unique praxis, the ability to take theoretically based knowledge and information and see whether or not in practice it works. Ling-Chi has been very instrumental at Berkeley in the formation and the development of the Ethnic Studies program, and has served as the chair of Asian American Studies and as the chair of the Ethnic Studies program, and has shepherded that program through to a development that now makes it probably the finest in the United States and probably the finest in the world. But his commitment to higher education and his commitment to education in general supersedes that because of the way in which he really unselfishly offers himself as an expert, as an advocate for major change in education, all the way from primary grades to higher education. On my right is Patricia Gandara, a very dear, close friend, who has an enormous wealth of background. Patricia not only is an extensive and a focused scholar, but she also has been very active in educational circles around the country. In fact, a long time ago, when she was just a kid, she was a commissioner for the California Post-Secondary Education Commission. She produced about a year ago a monumental study that has now been released by the National Post-Secondary Education Cooperative. In that study, she looked at the outreach, the enrichment programs that exist in the schools that lead to higher education. It is probably one of the most definitive studies you can find. And along with the bringing together in that compilation of the programs, she did a wonderful assessment of how effectively they were operating. So with that as an introduction to the three, I would now ask you to join me in welcoming Professor Oakes to begin this conversation. So.
thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I had the, I guess, the pleasure, the responsibility, sometimes he seemed like the pain in the neck, to be the co-chair of one of the working groups that helped develop the drafts of the master plan. And the committee I co-chaired was the Committee on Student Learning, which had a very broad and I think central charge, and that was to recommend changes in the policies and practices and structures of the pre-K through university system that would put student learning at the very center and really the driving force of California's education policy system, and at the same time create an extraordinarily high quality and supremely equitable system of schools, colleges, and universities for all of California's diverse young people. So with a little task like that set in front of us, there was a quite amazing and hardworking group of people who joined me in this task. We started about 18 months ago. Patricia Gondara was on the committee, as were representatives from probably most of the major stakeholder organizations in both K-12 schooling and in higher education. The interesting thing about this particular work group was we started out with this charge. We essentially were creating something from scratch. The vision of the 1960 California Master Plan, which promised tuition-free post-secondary education for all Californians who desired it, was now being expanded to say the state must also guarantee an extraordinarily high-quality, equitable system that's integrated kindergarten or pre-kindergarten through colleges and universities. And we had to figure out how you would take a vision like that embodied in the 1960 Master Plan and think about how you would ever extend that to the pre-K-12 system and create greater articulation between the two systems. We were one of 7 working groups, although I believe our group had the central charge. Other groups dealt with the professional staffing of schools and colleges and universities, facilities and finance issues, governance issues, a range of issues, and you've probably seen the list. If you've read this latest draft of the California Master Plan for this year, I think at the end there's a listing of all the committees that worked hard. I think our group, and I was interested in the panel last night because frankly, and I know this conference is so focused on higher education, that I was struck in the discussion of the master plan last night how little attention our committee paid to higher education. And I think the reason for that was because this enormous challenge of trying to think about incorporating the pre-college system into a master plan really became the giant task that we spent most of our time on. And frankly, because I think the weight of opinion in the group, and I suspect the weight of public opinion, is that California's system of higher education actually remains pretty robust and is admired and is thought of as high quality, while the system of pre-K-12 education enjoys a very different kind of reputation and status. So I think the lion's share of our attention went to really focusing on the pre-college system and how to align it and ensure quality for all students. And it was a group, even though it was a very political group, as well as being a group with lots of substance, there was extraordinary unanimity among the group about the importance of equity and educational justice as the driving force of our work, and that should be the goal of the master plan, which was interesting, fascinating, and meant for a very a rich set of discussions over a period of 18 months. I don't mean to imply at all that we agreed on everything, but there was this value, this sense that California's diversity had to be thought of as a positive, rich development in our state, and we needed to structure an educational system that capitalized on that diversity in ways that will enrich all of our lives. We actually began in part with an indicator of just how inequitable our system is, and that indicator that we looked at was in fact the eligibility rates for the University of California. And as you know, the target is that 12.5% of the high school graduates will be eligible for the University of California, and the eligibility criteria are set based on what the characteristics of that top 12.5% look like. And in fact, the white population in the state pretty much meets that target. 12.7% of the white high school graduates graduate eligible for the University of California. Asian populations do better than twice that well, whereas African Americans, only 2.8, and I wish I could show you these numbers, but I can't, 2.8% of the African American high school graduates, that certainly leaves out a whole lot of the 17 and 18-year-old African Americans in this state, but 2.8% of the black high school graduates are eligible for UC admission, and only 3.8 of the Latino population. So there's this enormous disparity in this end of high school indicator. Now, the committee did not focus on UC eligibility for the reason of saying our goal is to have everybody go to UC. This was not about UC, but this UC eligibility in this state is one of the most powerful indicators when you look at those statistics of what's happening with various groups in our state in terms of educational attainment and more importantly in my mind educational, or as important, educational access to higher education. So our committee began with a couple of premises though, that the disparities we see but the disparities we see in higher education, both in terms of access and in degree attainment, are caused in very large part by the inequalities created and perpetuated in K-12 schools. So one of the principle for us that linked K-12 and higher education is that many of the issues of diversity and disparities in higher education are really a function of inequitable policies, practices, and structures in K-12 schools, and therefore the master plan's first priority must be to address these problematic K-12 conditions. And I can just tell you the kinds of very basic variables we were looking at when we were talking about inequitable conditions. These were not fine-grained differences, but things like the disparities in the supply of qualified teachers. For example, that 20%, 24% of the schools in this state have more than 20%, so that's like a quarter of the schools in this state have faculties where more than 20% of the teachers are underqualified. Okay. That's more than 1,900 schools serving more than 1.7 million children. So 1.7 million children in this state are going to schools where 1 out of 5 teachers, at least, is underqualified. Now, of these 1,900 schools in this condition of them, 1,700 of them, and that means nearly all of them, are schools in the highest poverty categories, where more than 3/4 of the kids, more than 75% of the kids are on free and reduced lunch. So while there are this teacher shortage and these enormous numbers of schools that lack qualified teachers, nearly all of the schools with large numbers of unqualified teachers are schools serving poor children. And minority students are 5 times more likely than non-minority students and white students to have an underprepared teacher. So it's this, does a child have access to a fully prepared teacher? One of we'd say probably a floor criterion for a quality education. The answer in this state is many children do not, and in vastly disproportionate numbers, it's minority children and children who are poor who do not. 12% of the teachers in this state say they don't have enough textbooks for their children to use at school. 32% of the teachers in this state say they don't have enough textbooks so children can take them home at night and use them for doing work at home. Again, these are half of the people teaching science in this state say they do not have the equipment or the supplies necessary to engage their students in science experiments. These are basic education resources. Again, the disparities, those differences, the state aggregate differences across the state. When you disaggregate them, you see that the lack of resources, basic resources, textbooks, equipment for doing, supplies for doing science work, are disproportionately in schools with low-income children of color, vastly disproportionately. Facilities. There are 240 schools in this state, more than 350,000 children in this state who are attending schools that are so crowded. They are on year-round multi-track schedules, meaning that the school is full. The school is really 50% above capacity, so they're at 150% capacity. They're divided into 3 different schedules, 3 different tracks, so their kids going to school all of the time, moving in and out of school. But you can't do that unless you shorten the school year by 17 days. So there are those schools and these children, and they are nearly all children of color, children in poverty, who are getting 17 fewer days of school each year because the school just simply has not enough space to hold them. If you multiply, if you do the math, 17 school days a year over a course of a 12-year career is 204 days. That's more than a full year of instruction. So some students are being given a year less of schooling. Now, people will tell you, well, we've added extra minutes on the day, but we have a lot of research that says those minutes are not used for instruction, those extra minutes. So we went on and on in our committee looking at these conditions and said if the master plan does nothing, it needs to really address these fundamental conditions. Another issue that we looked at seriously was access to curriculum. We know that not only are there disparities in students' opportunities to take advanced academic courses, depending on the characteristics of the neighborhoods in which they live. So students who go to school live in low-income communities, communities of color, have far less access to advanced courses in mathematics and science and other subjects than do students who attend schools in more affluent white areas. Part of this is a function of the teacher shortage. Part of it is a function of seriously low expectations, beliefs, negative beliefs about the intelligence and the commitment and the determination and the values of people who live in low-income communities of color. And we felt we needed to do something about that. So the recommendations that come out of our work were that we needed to guarantee extraordinarily high quality, choice, and equity for all children. And by choice, we meant that every high school graduate in this state must have a meaningful choice of whether or not to go on to a 4-year university, a 2-year university, or a 2-year community college, go directly into the workforce. But that meaningful choice requires that all high school graduates are prepared to do well in any of those settings. That's a very ambitious kind of goal, and to operationalize it a bit, we recommended that not only that all high school students be enrolled as a default, at least the default curriculum enrollment is in the A through G course requirements required for CSU and USC, and that the community colleges too would agree that the A through G requirements represent the best kind of preparation for the experience for success at the community college level, but that also we change the nature of that curriculum somewhat, that we offer alternative ways to satisfy A through G that reach a broader and more diverse group of students. And importantly, and I think one of the most important recommendations we made, and one that's gotten very little discussion, Patricia and I worked very hard on this, is that every high school graduate be literate, fluent in 2 languages. And the effort here, frankly, was to recast the argument about bilingual education. To say knowing 2 languages, being bilingual, being literate in 2 languages is an enormous asset and a resource to individuals and to the society. And it's something we should want for all children. We have to stop thinking about bilingualism as a problem that the educational system has to overcome. So we made that recommendation. That recommendation remains today in the in the plan, the draft plan that was passed by the legislatures. Some of our recommendations do not remain, and I think it'll be interesting to see whether some of the recommendations resurface in the discussions about what kind of legislation or what kind of new regulations might flow out of this master plan work. We also believe that we would never, that simply guaranteeing the conditions that all children, and the list here is, I mean, it's in this master plan, every child be taught by a competent, fully qualified teacher or faculty member, receive a clear statement of the academic standards that define what he or she is expected to know and be able to do, receive an education including intervention that is sufficient to allow successful transition into the next levels of education and the workforce, including higher education, supplemental services when needed in order to achieve those goals, access to high-quality learning materials and resources and technology, counseling and academic advising, clean, modern, and safe school facilities, things that we think we shouldn't even have to put in a plan. They ought to be there without question. Information about all of the various options for post-secondary education. Not only did we try to build in recommendations for policies that made these guarantees, but in fact to require accountability for them, so that the state accountability system would be augmented. No longer would we only look at students' achievement scores, but also have indicators that say that demonstrate clearly the conditions under which those scores were obtained, so that we would have something like an opportunities for teaching and learning index that would show, in fact, the quality of resources, teaching, curriculum that was available to students. That remains in the master plan draft. And the third thing that I think is very important, so it's setting these very, very high goals, you know, to recognize the inequities and the disparities, to call for strong sets of policies that rectify them. And third is to put in place an accountability system that holds every person in every level of the system responsible. Right now we have an accountability system that holds children responsible for producing high test scores and that holds teachers and schools responsible. But once you leave the level of the school, nobody at district offices, county offices, state agencies, the governor's office, the legislature, nobody's accountable. So to begin to devise measures of how well these jobs are being done at all levels of the system and consequences if they're not being done well, including, for example, removing a particular function from a particular agency if, in fact, the resources and conditions are not being delivered to children. So I understand that this is a conference essentially about higher education, and this panel is about diversity in higher education. But my goal this morning was to share with you, I think, the one reason why the master plan draft looks the way it does, and frankly it's far more compromised than I would like to see it, is that we in our work believe strongly that in order to create equity in higher education access and success, we had to focus our attention and tackle these serious structural and policy problems in K-12. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Oates. Please hold your questions for her until the other two panelists have had an opportunity to speak. And I would like to answer part of the question that Professor Oak raised with regard to accountability in the school system. How good are we at asking for accountability of others? It seems like athletics are the only place we hold people accountable. If the coach doesn't work out, we fire him. We certainly don't do that with the corporate establishment like Enron. Who's accountable there? Do any of you know? Have they told us? All right, let's go on now. Patricia?
I think I would agree with Jeannie's assessment that a major problem with creating more diversity in higher education is simply the preparation of students in K-12, and that certainly that was a reason for shifting the focus strongly there. I think additionally, when you have a system that has the kind of reputation that California's higher education system has, it has its own problems. It's it's difficult to critique a system that is viewed as being so successful, but I would argue that there are some very, very deep problems in the system that we haven't paid attention to. And I would start with a really inequitable distribution of higher education opportunities. So beyond simply the issue of access to some kind of higher education, we have a problem of students clustered along the continuum of higher education in very different ways. So that some students, primarily students of color, are clustered very much at the lower end in the community colleges. And students who are more affluent and more mainstream tend to be clustered at the upper ends, at the University of California and in graduate and professional training. You know, sometimes you've got a panel here of 3 UC people, and you're probably going to get really tired of hearing about UC. And in fact, I've been chastised somewhat about this sort of obsession, you know, with UC and worrying about the most selective institutions. My response to that is that while 80% of the students in the state are not in the University of California system, or not in the most selective institutions, it is, in fact, the students who will move through that system who have the best shot at making it all the way through into graduate and professional schools and into the ranks of faculty. And I'm going to come back to that because I think that this is a critical problem in the pipeline for us. Because of this kind of clustering of some students at one end of the continuum and others at the other end of the continuum, we have what I would call sort of a skewing of the leadership class. In other words, very few people of color graduate who find themselves in graduate and professional education. So let me give you a couple of statistics, too, that sort of paint the picture for what's happening here in California. Some of this is colored substantially by the passage of Proposition 209 and the rather devastating impact that had on some of our institutions. But it was, you know, I like to remind people, we were in a bad situation before 209. 209 did not create a bad situation for us. It exacerbated an already intolerable situation. And with all the applause that people have been giving themselves about how we've recovered from 209, I want to remind you that we have not actually even come back to where we were before, and where we were before was pretty bad. So, for example, in 1995, 21% of the law school freshman class in the University of California was people of color, students of color. That's not too bad. That was largely carried by Berkeley and UCLA. In 2001, 11% were students of color. Hold these numbers in your head. I agree with Jenny. It's sort of hard to talk about numbers without being able to see them, but hold them in your head for a moment because I'm going to come back to something. In 1996, the medical school, entering medical school class was 12.8% students of color. And in 2001, it was 8.6%. Okay, so now we've got 11% in the law school. We've got 8.6% in the medical school. In graduate education, and that's across the board, all disciplines, all levels of graduate education, in 1995, 9.2% of the students entering were students of color. And in 2001, last year, it was 7.3%. So now we're between 7% and about 11%. In 20 years ago, 37%. Okay, so this is even going back, you know, sometime before 1995. I just decided to go back to the earliest time I could find some reasonable data for. And so 20 years ago, 37% of the students who were graduating from our high schools were students of color. Last year, in 2001, 52% were students of color. Now reflect back on those numbers, 7%, 8%, 10%, 11%. I mean, it's just a very, very small fraction of the students who are coming out of our high schools are making it through that pipeline. So then what ultimately happens when you look at the kind of representation we have amongst faculty? the people who will teach, the people who will lead, the people who will make the kinds of decisions for these institutions into the future. Who's there? Well, last year, 7.5% of all of the faculty at all the ranks in the University of California were people of color. And I have to tell you that at the faculty level, that gets interpreted very broadly. It's very easy to fall into the category of Hispanic. Doesn't mean you came from a Mexican-American family, a Chicano family. Doesn't mean you came from, you may have been somebody who was really quite advantaged in your own country, in Colombia or someplace else. Yeah, there are a lot of issues there. So I'm just saying that it's a liberal interpretation when we say 7.5%. In 1981, 20 years ago, before a lot of this huge demographic shift, 4.1% of the faculty in the University of California were people of color by the same definition. So we have not come very far in 20 years. And a big reason why we haven't come very far is because we have choked off the pipeline, because we're not getting people through. And so this illusion of the conversations around access, I mean, we have to ask access for what? Access to what? And what is the distribution of those opportunities? And I would argue that they're very skewed. Although K-12, education at the level of K-12 is interpreted in this state as well as in the other 49 states as being a right, a constitutional right protected by the state constitution, higher education is not viewed as such. Higher education is viewed as a privilege. This is not something the state has to provide for you. It's something that the state may provide and that you may avail yourself of. But that's in spite of the fact that we now have very good data that shows that opportunity is arrayed in a very linear fashion along the lines of how much higher education you have. And so your chances in this society, both economic and social, are very dependent upon your ability to access higher education in a real way. Higher education in California, as in the rest of the nation, is a rationed resource. It's something that we have very limited amount of, and we ration it. Our current projections show that if nothing changes in the way we are doing things now, this kind of skewing that Jeannie started talking about in terms of, these horrendous numbers of 2.8% of African Americans being eligible for UC and so on, we anticipate that this situation will actually get worse. And if we continue to ration access using the same kinds of indicators of merit that we do today, which is essentially some kind of combination of grades and test scores, and I have to tell you, I'm very cynical about this, get rid of the SAT, no, change it to the SAT2, no, change it to some other, every kind of modeling that we have done on this shows that it makes so little difference, it's hardly worth the discussion. It doesn't matter what test you put in there. Ultimately, it doesn't even matter if you don't have a test, because all the other rankings fall out in the same way as well. Unless we really fundamentally shift our notions about merit and who deserves to be there or why certain people might deserve to be there, unless we really rethink these notions, the projections are that we will continue to do fundamentally what we're doing now, and that is seriously skewing the system. We are not currently closing any gaps. And in fact, it would require much, much more than changing tests or even strengthening schools somewhat in order to really equalize opportunity in higher education. I think the reason I do what I do is because I am really fundamentally very optimistic, but when you start looking at the numbers and you start looking at the picture and you start looking at it over time, it is hard not to be cynical. We have a society that essentially has no social policy for dealing with low-income underrepresented, marginalized populations. We do nothing about poor people to try and really equalize their situations, or people who are marginalized in our society. We have no family policy. We have no preschool, child care policy. We don't have any of the things that most every other modern industrialized nation provides in order to help provide some kind of a floor for that population. What we have is schools. And so we throw these problems of gross social inequalities onto our schools, and we say, you fix them. And we throw them a bone, and we say, and if you don't fix them, then clearly you have failed. Well, I think our society has failed in the way we have viewed these problems and the way we have viewed schools as being solely responsible for fixing the problems that we have allowed to fester and, in fact, concretize. So on that note, I will kind of wrap this with saying that, I think that if we were really to change this, if we were really to close gaps, if we were really to equalize opportunity, we would have to do things very, very differently than we're doing them now. And I only see 3 real possibilities for that. I see that we could create schools that are capable of undoing all of the social inequalities that exist. And how we would do that, I don't think there's a person alive who knows quite how we would do that. But clearly, at a minimum, it would require massive resources beyond anything any of us has ever conceived of. Or we would have to change our definitions of merit in the sense of what it means to merit a higher education. Or we would have to fund a system that does not ration opportunity. We would have to have seats for all people who want those seats. And that, again, every one of those definitions requires a level of resource investment that nobody has even come close to talking about. But I would argue that the way we're approaching things now makes me question our sincerity when we say we really want to close the achievement gaps. And for me, remains an issue of illusory opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you, Patricia. Those are very sobering thoughts that you've shared with us. I want to very quickly remind all of you that to understand why a condition exists the way it is demands looking at some very fundamental factors that condition why people behave the way they do. Look at the simpleton in the White House and his policy of aggression in the Middle East. All you have to do is follow the oil. The same thing is true with regard to our educational establishment in California and perhaps the nation as well. Just follow the money. Lynchy?
Thank you. As long as we have the White House, I like the Bush's slogan, "Leave no child behind." But I wonder what kind of resources that you talk about to ensure that we leave absolutely no child behind. I mean, that really is one of the major problems that we face now. I agree with Jeannie that that I think a lot of our problem has to do with what we do as a state in terms of our K-12 education, and I think she's pretty well demonstrated, the kind of problem, the severity of problem that we have in California. And then I think, Patricia, I also agree with you. I think we need to ask very, very tough questions about how do we rethink, meritocracy. Many of you undoubtedly have read Derek Bach and William Bowen's so-called Bible or the book that I think my chancellor, Robert Burdall, liked to use to swear by to support affirmative action, because that is supposed to be the most definitive work about how affirmative action has really worked well and successfully and why it should be supported continuously. And yet, if you take a look at his conclusion, when it comes to the question about meritocracy, of course, they represent the establishment and meritocracy itself. So they never at any point, in spite of the very, very, very concrete proof about how affirmative action has really successfully worked in all those 26, 30 schools that they studied, over time, they did not reach any conclusion about how to fundamentally change the meritocracy. And of course, the same institution that they represent, Harvard and Princeton University, continue to perpetuate that kind of meritocracy. So as long as that kind of hypocrisy continue to exist in our society, it's going to be very, very tough. Now, I want to take a slightly different take in my presentation. My colleague, and I have many colleagues in Berkeley who are outstanding scholars who have done, important studies on higher education. Professor Neil Smeltzer, who has done a very important piece of work on California's higher education back in the 1970s. Of course, Professor Marty Troll also have done important studies on higher education. If you take a look at their studies and about how the system works, it's very interesting, especially Neil Smeltzer, who of course is always being quoted for the most definitive work on higher education. It's interesting that he, totally disassociates his studies from the social, political, and economic environment of higher education system. In fact, he went out of his way to say that that is not the purpose of his study. He was only interested in how the system loses its equilibrium internally. So, his famous study of the growth and conflict and expansion of higher education, you look at that study, it's very interesting that you actually could divorce the institution from its social, political, and economic environment. I don't know how you can do that kind of research on higher education and expect any kind of insight into the problems that are facing us. Now, when we look at the master plan for higher education in 1960, when it was first formulated, I think there were some interesting things that to observe. I think we were just coming out of the Second World War. The population of California was growing tremendously by leaps and bounds. In 1940, California's population was only 6.9 million, but by 1960, it had grown up to 15.7 million. But the interesting thing about that figure is that, of course, at that time, actually, about 16% minority, racial minority. In fact, Latino at that time in that census was considered white. In fact, there were 4% Latino reported in the 1960 census. And now, what was also happening at that time, of course, was a rapid suburbanization of California. Suburbs began to grow, and also at the advent of the so-called military-industrial complex in California, with the high-tech development in aerospace and electronic industries, which therefore created a huge demand for more technical and professional type of people. And so, not surprisingly, the higher education and the master plan was used to essentially to turn out the people that was needed. And and there was a lot of demand for access to higher education, and of course we used the master plan to do a lot of expansion, and the legislature actually at that time had some political courage, I have to say. At least they were trying to put a distance between higher education development with politics to the extent possible. The idea behind the master plan, of course, is to the extent possible to have a rational approach for the development of higher education institution, and then minimizing politics. Of course, in America, in California, you cannot talk about education without talking about politics. But at least that was an honest attempt to try to do something about it. And of course, I think we also have a fairly visionary people in higher education. And I think in particular about Clark Kerr, who got appointed to the presidency of UC system in 1958, who played a crucial role in the development of the master plan for higher education. Now people can debate about, controversial role that Clark Kerr played. I myself have a lot of disagreement with him, but where is our Clark Kerr of the 21st century today in higher education? We don't have any visionary people. We don't have courageous politicians who are willing to stand up and talk about the kind of thing that Patricia talked about that needs to be discussed. You can talk about the problems of K through 12, the problems of higher education from here until doomsday. If nothing is done here in Sacramento about it, I don't think we're able to resolve some of those problems. Now, what I'd like to suggest now is that let's take a look at what has been happening since then in terms of higher education. As we stand at the beginning of the 21st century, and then of course revising our master plan. Well, if you take a look at the demographics, and I think we heard a lot about it already, but just a reminder, the year 2000 census showed that California, of course, experienced another very rapid population growth, and on top of that, the linguistic and racial diversity in our population that wasn't there in 1940 census and in 1960 census. But in 2000 census, California now has 34 million. We have more than double our population since then. And we have 47% white, 7% black, 32.4% Latino, and 12% Asian American, and 0.5% Native Americans. We also, very interestingly, we have also another comparable kind of labor market transformation that took place back in the 50s and 60s, had taken place also in California. We have now shifted our labor market to a knowledge-based economy, which of course amount to even greater demand for better educated workforce in California. In fact, there is, in spite of our expansion of higher education, there is still a very serious shortage of technical and professional people, and hence, last year, as recently as last year, before the recession, Congress authorized the emissions of 200,000 H-1B visas. In part, primarily, actually, because of California. California high-tech industry make those demands because our universities simply are not turning out. But one should not be surprised that our universities are not turning out those people. Remember back in the 60s, when Clark Kerr presided the expansion of UC system, under his leadership, UC built 4 new campuses: Irvine, Santa Barbara, San Diego, and Santa Cruz. Fast forward to year 2000, population had more than doubled, more diversified, more multiracial, and have we increased one single UC campus since then? We had 9 in 1960s, and we still have the same 9. Gray Davis is promising us opening the door of UC Merced in year 2004. If you take a visit to the site that is designated, it's total barren, only 1 tree on the entire site. And guess why the tree was there? Because there was a leaky pipe.
But the vernal pools are there.
Only seasonally. So, is there any reason to doubt that why we had Proposition 209? In 1980s, when I was involved in a huge fight with my own chancellor, at that time was Chancellor Heyman, and the UC president was David Gardner, over whether there was any racial discrimination against Asian American or not. And of course, that controversy lasted 5 years, from 1984 to 1989, with Chancellor Heyman's apologizing to the Asian American for the wrong policies that were secretly implemented against Asian American applicants. But that's besides the point. But during the course of that 5 years of debate, I think it finally dawned on President Gardner that the problem is really the lack of opportunity. So he then commissioned in 1987, with the approval of the regents, to undertake a study about whether, to what extent California need additional UC campuses. In 1988, the report came out, and that report, by the way, is still gathering dust in the president's office. The report actually demonstrated that California needed to build another 3 UC campuses in order to accommodate the population growth. The fact of the matter is that we completely ignore those recommendations. And of course, partly complicated by the recession of the 1990s. So finally, somebody got enough courage to say that that's at least built 1 in Merced. And I doubt very much that 2004 we're going to open the door and admit the first 1,000 students, unless there are some other facilities there that I don't know. That's already there. So, I really think that I wonder if the 1988 proposal to build 3 additional new campuses, had that been proceeded whether actually we will have 209 today or not. You know, it's really is a perception of absence of opportunity. Now with 209, guess what is happening? The people who advocated 209 are finding themselves still not catching up. I mean, what is happening, of course, the group that stands to benefit the most has been Asian American. And so now you have, Irvine and Riverside already gone beyond. In fact, a year before the passage 209, I predicted that within 5 years, now I'm being proven wrong, that I thought that within 5 years after 209, that all 9 UC or 8 UC's campus of undergraduate program will have at least 50% Asian American, at which time we will then experience a huge backlash against Asian Americans, like the way we experienced back in the 1980s during the fight over whether there was a discrimination practice against Asian Americans or not. And I think that is coming. It's already, I hear a lot of debate. And if you have any doubts about all these debates about changing policy, and none of those policies you see will ever bring the kind of diversity that you're talking about. And we totally agree with you. Not one single one. I don't care if you have a dual admission, you have 4%, you have 12.5%, you abolish SAT 1, none of which will work. And of course, all of which there is a subtext behind it. How do we really curb the number of Asian Americans in UC system? I think that what we really need, the other problem that I wanted to highlight is that our higher education system, I also agree with Patricia, is that there was nothing to brag about before 2009. And I think what has happened in the meantime with the population increase is that we, of course, expand the bottom of higher education. If you take a look at where the expansion is taking place, the community colleges, even though we still have only 100, basically 106 community colleges for several years already, and yet the student body has been expanding, and the latest report indicates that we now have 1.7 million in the community colleges now across the state. And the sad thing about this, the expansion is, of course, community colleges, in fact, have betrayed the original promises. I think there have been several studies. Fred Pincus back in going back to the 50s, President Clark talked about how the promises turned out to be really not quite true back in the 50s in his study of the San Jose City College. And then Fred Pincus talked about the false promises of community colleges. And then even more recently, Stephen Brent and Jerome Parabel, the so-called the diverted dream. All of them are talking about the original dual twin function of community college. One is to prepare college transfer to 4-year college, and the other one is, of course, to provide vocational education. I think those two should be balanced, but what happened is that over time, as Carabel and Brint pointed out in their study, that the community college administrators basically capitulated to business and industry's demand to train workers for them. So as a result, we have this horrible situation where you see, at least President Atkinson claimed that he was embarrassed that only 9,000 a year get transferred into UC system from the 1.7 million students that we have in our community colleges. Well, the system never was set up to, it was originally set up for that purpose, but once it got implemented, it was really mostly for job training, not for transfer. And I think, Burton Clark was the first one to develop this idea of the cooling out process that community college students, when they first arrive in community college, were subjected to. Essentially, with batteries of tests and counselors, we pour a bucket of cold water on each student's head and said that, look, you are not college transfer material, so you take these other courses instead. And that's what it's been going on in our community colleges. And that's why, I'm not surprised that only 9,000 transfer each year to the UC campuses. So I think that our community colleges have not been doing its job, and as has been pointed out already, that both CSU and UC system have not been serving the people of California. Original plan, of course, was for the for the so-called land-grant university, which University of California, is to serve the people of California, but we seem to be only serving the industries nowadays. Now, there are some very alarming things that are happening in California which will be, which is going to lead to my conclusion here. I think there are three very interesting political developments that I think contributed to the kind of lack of vision, lack of political courage, and lack of commitment to do something about our educational system. And I consider all these to be efforts to divest, in fact, from investment in education and to transfer income to the people who are in power and people who are rich. Number one, you have to go back to the tax revolt in Proposition 13. I think that essentially forced politicians to go for more and more tax cuts in order to get themselves reelected. I mean, that has become the rule now. No politician, even in the face of a huge deficit, for instance, President Bush is still talking about tax cut, more tax cuts. I don't know where the money is going to come from, and then how the rest of the people in America are going to be served. No one there to talk about investment in education, in health, in environment, in mass transit in the state of California. No one. Number two, we have become extremely obsessed with personal safety, especially of our California white voters. We are totally, obsessed with law and order. I think you will remember how in the 1970s and 1980s, that's all we talked about. And of course, eventually, California led the nation in enacting the three-strike laws and embarked upon the most massive prison building in the United States. At the time when this three-strike legislation was adopted, the legislative analysts projected that in order to meet the increasing demand for more jails, California needed to invest $21 billion in prison construction and maintenance program for the next 10 years. Which led me to conclude that perhaps if we are not willing to put money into UC and CSU, perhaps we should start calling UC San Quentin, UC Folsom, UC Vacaville, and might as well do something with the money that we're putting in there and to educate those people, because it costs just as much. In fact, it costs more to put a person in California prison than to put a person in UC system. And that is really the most disgraceful thing that is happening in California. Then the third thing that is been happening in California is the move toward privatization. You hear this word nowadays a lot of time about private. This amounts, of course, to transfer income from the public to the private and from the poor to the rich. And what does that mean? It means tax cuts, it means charter schools, school vouchers, Edison School, and corporate intrusion, and even takeover of segments of higher education. And you're seeing this happening in UC already. It began when Atkinson was San Diego campus, and now it has almost become a system-wide policy where everything in UC is up for sale. Any corporations could come in, like Novartis, one of the world's biggest pharmaceutical company. 3 years ago, dangled a carrot in front of UC Berkeley and said to the College of Natural Resources, "Can we give you $25 million?" Of course, UC grabbed it, but the condition is, of course, Novartis get to put their scientists in the labs of College of Natural Resources. And you know what's that for? I don't have to tell you that. And then we're even talking about launching business school, law school, engineering college into become independent entity and let them collect tuition. And by the way, those schools can do quite well. Just take a look at Santa Clara University, which is already private to begin with, and the law school is now actually run independent of the university, Santa Clara University. All that the law school faculty do is to pay Santa Clara University campus X millions of dollars, and then they are totally, outside of the control of university. So that's what I mean by privatization. There's a lot of things, new ideas coming out, a lot of ideas about privatization, but no ideas about how to deal with the educational problems. And then certainly no will and efforts to put in more resources into educational system. So in spite in spite of the demographic changes, therefore, I think when we look around the politics in California, I think it's very clear that political power remains in the hand of the traditional white political elite. And the majority of California remains disenfranchised. The last gubernatorial campaign, 1998 election, about 80% of the voters were white. So it means that the majority of California, which is of course made up of minorities, actually has been totally disenfranchised. We have and then when you look at the curriculum from K through 12 and then into higher education, it's pathetic. We still, in spite of all these talks about diversifying the curriculum, ethnic studies, bilingual, bicultural education, rest assured that it's still very, very Euro-American centric. Very little. I mean, I think Berkeley, among all the campuses, probably has done a much better job in diversifying the curriculum than any campus that I could think of across the state of California, including all three segments of higher education. In 1969, Ethnic Studies Department was established in Berkeley. At that time, take a look at the 5,000 courses offered in Berkeley catalog. Not a single course dealing with minorities. I mean, sure, Robert Browner was doing a course on theories of race relations. Lawrence Devine was teaching a course, and Leon Litwack were talking about slavery in the South, but nothing, not a course about racial minorities among those 5,000. Today, I'm proud to say that there are about 500 courses across 45 departments and programs, and therefore not necessarily in Ethnic Studies Department. In fact, it's about 200 courses. So there are 500 courses so something is happening there, but we still have such a long way to go. As long as we don't do something about the curriculum from K through 12 and in higher education, we cannot even begin to think multiracial and multicultural, and forget about democracy. So I think what we need really are visionary higher education leaders who can really forcefully articulate the issues for the 21st century, and especially in advocating for investment in education. I think we need more campuses to expand opportunity, and I think we also need to, and this is really serious, I think we need to recommit ourselves to the idea of liberal arts education. I'm just so afraid now the entire UC system and CSU is now being transformed into a vocational educational system now. I mean, everything is about high tech. Already we know 40% of UC undergraduate are now in biological and health related sciences now. 10 years ago it was all in electrical engineering and computer science. That is driving where UC is going now. Not because of our commitment to an educated public to the idea of liberal arts education. I think we need very visionary educator, and we need very courageous and visionary political leaders who are willing to talk about raising revenue to invest in the future of California, especially in education. And we need, of course, above all, these politicians who are willing to talk about political reform that will really empower the new majority of California, rather than empowering, in fact, or disempowering the majority and then perpetuating the privileged status of the minority in California. I think that my final point that I wanted to make is that 2 points. One is that I think, what I just mentioned, I think we need to have much more forceful articulation and determination to diversify our curriculum. And I think we need to revisit community colleges and to see why we are now so overwhelmingly job training based, rather than a balance between vocational education and college transfer credit programs there. Thank you.
Thank you, Lin Chi. Let's take a very quick poll because I want to dramatize something. Would the African Americans in the room please raise your hand? All right, look at those hands that you see in the air right now. And think that less than half, about 5, African Americans are in the entering class at the medical school in San Francisco. Okay? 5. Whereas 20 years ago, there would have been 25, maybe 30. And we need African American doctors, not just in the health delivery services, but also as leaders in communities. Next, think carefully about what Lin Chi said regarding the capitulation of the leadership or lack of leadership in the community colleges. Follow the money. Private industry comes in and says, we need workers, and the community college boards and presidents respond. Why? It's cheaper to do that because if you hire a full-time person in a community college, you're going to have to pay them benefits. And so these unscrupulous individuals only look at that stupid bottom line. And every time I hear that expression, I'd like to punch out somebody's lights. Because sometimes we need to run education not as a for-profit venture, but for a loss because it's good for our community. We haven't said anything about the state university system. And in that are what I consider some very serious misconceptions on the part of the people of California. Take a look for a moment at where the money is to support higher education in California. Look at it like a pyramid. The greatest amount of money per student, the greatest expenditure by the state of California for education is up at the UC system, including making bombs. The smallest amount of money per student is where? It's at the community colleges. Now invert that pyramid. Where are the largest number of students? They're at the very bottom of the triangle. Well, in the middle of all of this is the state university system, which probably has the worst attrition rate. If you just look at the 3 campuses of the state university system in the Los Angeles basin, people of color go through there like a revolving door in a hurricane, and nobody seems to care. The last thing I'll say to kind of focus your attention on what is occurring is when you take the problems of the schools, P through 12, and you mesh them with higher education, we tend to conveniently ignore the concerns of higher education because we are overwhelmed by what we consider to be the problems in P through 12. And that, I put it to you, is like putting your neck in a noose because it's going to come back to haunt us in the very near future. We've had some wonderful ideas and discussion placed before you. Now I'd like to hear from you and do interchange and exchange with our panel. David?
Yeah, I raised the question last night, and after I raised it, I realized I raised it to the wrong panel. So I'd like to raise it again. When I was an undergraduate in the 1970s, there were approximately 3 Latino men per every Latina. From the 1970s to the year 2000, that has inverted very quickly. And so now when I teach my Chicano Studies classes, there are 3 Latinas for every Latino in my class. If you look at the overall statistic, I come from California State University, Sacramento, it's about 60-40 split. So what I worry about, and I raised this issue last night, is that the scarcity of African American males in higher education now, in the future, will be mirrored in the Latino community. I don't think anyone's talking about that, and that really worries me. Thank you.
That's Professor David Leon from Sacramento State University. There's a gentleman in the back of the room who had his hand up. Please identify yourself, and there's a microphone going around. Let me say that the issue that David raises is a very serious one, and it has very long-term negative consequences if it isn't addressed. And if you don't believe me, just ask any well-trained, educated African-American woman, and she'll tell you right away. Sir?
My name is T. Fox. I'm a PhD student at Claremont Graduate University in Education. And one of the things that I'm very concerned about is when we say and use the terminology underqualified teacher. What does it mean to be a qualified professor? Does it mean that you obtain a PhD or a terminal degree without taking any classes in pedagogy or methodology? So many professors at the university sit in the classroom and they obtain content knowledge but do not know how to teach. So many of the underrepresented students are sitting in the classrooms and are not learning. And so that has, I would believe, a significant impact on the attrition rate. But we don't want to address the faculty and how they're participating in even in the teaching training institutions, telling the teachers to go out and do something one way using multiple intelligences, but they're standing up only using one modality. And I see that as hypocritical. Thank you.
Would any of the panel members like to respond to that?
You know, I'm not in teacher education, but I'm just really surprised at the kind of things that, for instance, when Governor Gray Davis, announced that he was going to be remembered as an education governor, and education was going to be his top priority, and then of course he determined that what California needs is more high quality teachers, and guess who he turned to for teachers training? University of California. And I don't know if you know what's the percentage of teachers being turned out by UC system? 4% a year, right? I cannot understand this kind of a logic at all. I'm sure there are a lot of great researchers and professors in UC system, but it seems to me if you're going to put the money into training of teachers, you should put it in where teachers are being trained, not in the hands of people who are who in fact seems to disdain the idea of even training teachers is below their dignity. I'm sorry to say that about my own institution.
I can respond to that as someone who participates in teacher education at UCLA. It was a bizarre thing when Davis turned to the UC because he created a program and a demand on the University of California to double its production of teachers and to create a scholarship program which would allow 200 teachers a year to be prepared at UC at no cost to them. There was not $1 given to anybody to support any of those programs. That was all pronouncements, status, wishful thinking. In fact, the UC teacher ed programs have in fact met that challenge of doubling their output. And I think there are some pretty amazing teacher education programs in some of the UC campuses. But all of that was talk. That was not anything real. In fact, I'd like to respond to what you're saying, because I think this is a critically important concern, especially as we want to expand access and success, is to really think not only about diversifying the curriculum, which I agree with you is critically important, but diversifying the range of pedagogical strategies that we use in classrooms, K through graduate education. It would be a mistake even if we could get the amazing change of diversifying the curriculum, then to teach it in the same old crummy ways that provide access to such a narrow band of students. But in fact, I think the policies in this country are going exactly in the opposite direction. That most of the No Child Left Behind policies, one of the strongest recommendations in there, and the way states have responded to it, fundamentally undermines the training of teachers in K-12 and wants to make them more like university professors, that all that really matters is subject matter, content knowledge, not about knowing how to teach. So I think you need to keep asking that question, but ask it about K-12 and higher education, because the policy directions go in the other way.
And I would just add one thing to it. I think that it's, because I've actually looked at this issue a bit too, and I find it very interesting that there's a lot of research out there on effective strategies for teaching in the K-12. Nobody even asked the question, what's an effective strategy for teaching in higher education? We simply don't know. We kind of extrapolate and figure, well, if it's good for an 11-year-old, it must be good for a 30-year-old. But there's no reason to necessarily believe that. And of course, the one thing that we do, we really could be fairly certain about is that when you raise classes to the size of 500 and 700 and 800, that's probably not good pedagogy. And yet, that's where the policies are leading us.
Oh, no, do it online. Nadia?
Good morning. I had a question. There's been a lot of focus on...
Identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Nadia Diaz. I'm with the Executive Fellows Program. And there's been a lot of focus on getting kids to the door and why that's important, secondary education. But I'd like to know, how is the master plan, or how are we rethinking keeping kids there and getting them to graduate? And 209, of course, I think fed a lot of that when we had not a lot of people, a certain number getting in, but the number that were actually graduating was very, very low. And I think that sort of fed that. Well, they're not qualified, they shouldn't be there in the first place. And is that being rethought? And if so, how is that being?
Good question, Nadia.
I'll respond initially to that. In a way, I'll respond to that. If you live long enough, you get to see everything come around again. And I'm no, I'm talking about me, actually. Because I don't want to admit to my age here, but I do remember in the 1970s the massive push to diversify the institutions, and all of the programs up and running to get students. All of a sudden we discovered that our institutions were not really serving the full population, and so we did a whole lot of things about it. The federal government got involved in the TRIO programs and opened up the AOP all over the place. And it took about 5 years, I think, before it hit people that this was a revolving door, that they were coming in one door and going out the next, without graduating. And so everybody discovered retention. This was the mid to late 70s. There was this epiphany. Retention. This is what we need to focus on. And so indeed we shifted a lot of resources in the institutions to retention. And we built some fabulous programs, and we had people, who just really knew how to do this. And then since we'd solved that problem, we stopped providing resources for it. And we didn't train a new generation of people to take over these programs, and so now we're back again at, worrying about, we're about 5 years now past 209, so it's just about time for us once again to look at, after our big push to try and restore the numbers coming in the front door, how do we keep them from going out the back door? And I think you raise a really good point. So given that we've had about 5 years of this, I expect that any day now, people are going to be getting serious about doing something around retention. But of course, that the cynical side of me, Ling-Chi, has to say that that's only if we figure out how to get enough seats, because actually this is a good solution. If you can't retain them, that frees up a seat.
Let me add to what Nadia said, because it's very critical for you to think in this kind of expanded process. Think something through. Don't just let it rest at one point. Not only is it essential for us to consider retention, but because of the crisis in leadership that Ling-Chi is talking about and that Patricia referred to, we must also figure out how to get these students to go on to the best graduate programs. Okay? We don't just want to get them out the door with a degree. We want them to go on. Now, the other factor that's hidden in all of this, that's subsumed within the retention, is the cavalier attitude of the faculty. They're the ones who caused the problem initially because, first, either they're not good teachers or they're completely remote and distant from the students. And who do they blame? Well, of course they blame the students, and then they step away and they say, all right, you, the institution, create some kind of way to kind of remediate these kids and get them through. But they take no responsibility for what it is that they are doing or not doing to encourage the successful matriculation of those students. And as long as that distance occurs, this problem, as Patricia said, is going to come back to haunt us in cycles. Another question in the back of the room. I'll get to you with the flower later. I promise.
My name is Gwyneth Tracy, and I'm with the California Community College's Chancellor's Office. I'm also a doctoral student up at Oregon State University in community college
Are
leadership.
you one of Betty Duvall's students?
That's all right. Yes, I am.
Say hello to her the next time
I
you see
will.
her.
I'm going to see her next weekend. Anyway, I want to sort of maybe correct a perception about the community colleges, as you could expect. Our community colleges, back in the 60s and early 70s, there were requirements to enter the community college. You had to have a C average from your high school, and you had to have a specific score on the ACT before you were even allowed in the community college. Hence, I think that's where Clark Kerr's emphasis on transfer came. Junior colleges, they truly were. They prepared for transfer because they had requirements and baselines of what you had to be able to do. In the 70s, the community colleges became open access. They were legislated to open their doors to everybody. And yes, they do a great deal of workforce preparation, which is not cheap. It's much cheaper actually to teach a lecture class in English 101 than to do workforce preparation, which requires constantly updating modern equipment and modern skills. Increase that look to identify that we have to import workers from other countries because we do not have enough qualified workforce. Obviously, we are not preparing people to work in our economy, and so they do come to the community colleges because that seems to be the only place that they are able to get it, to get the training they need. And it's not that administrators don't want to transfer. We have some administrators that we actually have some challenges with because they would love to be only transfer colleges. But that's not the name of the game when you're a community college speaking to the needs of community, which includes workforce preparation. Thank you. And I'll mention
Sure,
Betty
go ahead,
Duvall.
Lynchy.
I just make a brief comment.
Thank you.
I think what Brent and Carabelle talked about is really the lack of balance between the two missions of community college. We have completely allowed one side to overwhelm.
Yeah.
Now, also, I think that the community college can never turn out the kind of people that the industries are now bringing into this country through H-1B visa. They're talking about engineers who are already trained with a college degree. And unless community college can train large number of them to go into engineering program in the 4-year system, we will continue to be importing these H-1 visa, to the tune of 200,000 a year.
Good point. Let's go to the young woman in the back with the flower.
My name is Amy Spinetta. I work as a researcher at the Center for Digital Education in Folsom, but I also live in Amador County and have a farm there, and I'm a member of the Farm Bureau and just interested in expanding the definition of diversity and really wondering if Jeannie and Patricia's research, if at all you looked at rural poor and their entrance rates into the UCs, and also I realized that you didn't mention Native Americans, and I just wanted you to address both of those.
Yeah, actually, you bring up a very good issue, and it's one that I think we're not going to get into in much depth at this point. But I have been doing a fair amount of research looking at rural versus urban populations and aspirations and movement across the education pipeline. And I think there's a reason for really grave concern because, in fact, if you look at the data, rural poor tend to do more poorly than urban poor in many cases, and yet our focus is almost exclusively on urban areas, and I think it really is a forgotten population. And in the schools that we've looked at, we could almost characterize the bigger threats in urban areas as being sort of the classic ones that many people are worried about, is violence in the schools and social problems. Whereas in the rural areas, what we've seen is the biggest threat may be ignorance, essentially ignorance about the opportunities that exist out there and the lack of information that actually flows through those communities. So I think you raise a very good point on that.
We're just about out of time, but I want to address that point. in the last 2 months, I spoke at 2 rural programs. The Migrant Scholars Program at Cal State Bakersfield and the Migrant Program for Access to Higher Education at Fresno. They're good programs. They don't get very much visibility, and they're almost exclusively dependent upon federal funding. But when I looked at the programs, there were only 3 men out of 150 people in that program at Bakersfield, and there were only 4 out of 110 men in the rural program at Fresno. So I think the point that David raises is really scary, and it's something that we have to address. And of course, it's not addressed in the master plan.
Can I just say one other thing about that? Yeah, because we did, David, we kind of moved away from your question, and it's a terribly, terribly important question, as you pointed out. I just want to add one more thing onto that, you know, many of the federal and state programs that have come in to try and address the problems of underrepresentation of certain groups of students, the TRIO programs and all of these things, ironically, they're put into place to try and equalize opportunity, and yet they also are attended in virtually the same disproportionate numbers by males and females. So the programs that are supposed to kind of even things up actually are quite popular with females and quite unpopular with males. So we're not even capturing them within this sort of safety net that we've put out there. So we certainly have to think in terms of what do we do about repairing the safety net, you know, once they don't come in the first way. What do we do about that second level of opportunity that we're providing, because we don't seem to know how to capture them there either.
I think the U.S. Army does a better job of capturing Latino men in colleges and universities.
They do the same thing for African American men. You've been a wonderful audience. I know that there will be a little bit of time among the panelists to talk with you afterward, but thank you.
Thank you. You know, I guess I've been just kind of upset about our politicians. You know,
Frankly, I've thought hard about lack of seats in relationship to 209. I've been really worried about the Asian back. Are there on ethnic?
it's coming. It's in the form of the State Senate Special Committee now on reading and writing. That's what we're
mention kind of the key issues that we talked about today for further clarification. One is, how do you determine which materials to purchase of the 4 core subjects? This is more challenging for us this time because since standards were adopted, we've had frameworks that have come after adoptions and adoptions that have come before frameworks, and we've had quite a challenge with implementing the reforms over the last 5 years. So to calibrate that, we talked about what districts have to do. their standards maps, as is required by law when they make their purchases for the core areas. Then finally, a last-minute proposal came in from the board staff, from Greg Geating, in regards to the discussions they've been having. And there was a proposal that was worked out with the administration that there would be a set-aside of the funding for purposes of using it for supplemental materials during a pilot period. Now, we just got this language, so we're looking it over too. But what that means is, it's somewhat complicated. When there's a primary adoption and it triggers the 24 months and it triggers the requirement to buy in the core area, there were representatives who worked with the governor's office who wanted a window during the pilot phase to purchase other materials. So what the board office and the administration agreed to was a $9 per pupil set aside for that purpose during a pilot phase. Now, some concerns were raised about that only because on the one level, in our view at the department, we were concerned it exceeded the board's authority to just set percentages, not dollar amounts. Secondly, it could stagnate when you have a pot of money in a regulation, and then appropriations change over time, so it could be more than you intended or it could be less. So we proposed, if they were going to go forward with this proposal, which I think they intend to, that it be a percentage rather than a dollar amount, and keep that percentage, it should be low, of course. However, the agreement was that the staff would go back, the board staff in particular, and work this through to make sure it indeed is what the governor's office wants to see and what the board wants to see. So that was a last minute piece. The other last minute piece was the board is making it clear that they want the adopted lists from 2001 and 2002 and thereon for reading, language, arts, and math. And so that would exclude the 2519 list. And that discussion, we've had that briefly here. There are differing opinions about that, but it will probably move forward. And so that'll kind of calibrate the dates, and those will move on. And the only suggestion we made on that was to say on or after, because this is a point in time, and we'll have additional adoptions in the future based on standards-aligned frameworks. So the pot doesn't stay just in this next couple of years. So with that, I know that's a lot to digest. That's kind of in a nutshell where this is going. And by mid-December, I think I'll be able to send you something that's final from the board office, but I can also send you the rest of the materials you didn't get to see in your packet for this meeting too.
Just a teeny one. On the 2519 funding, that cycles out in 2003, doesn't it? So is this...
It does for math.
For math, okay. And so does this supersede that so that there's an earlier cutoff, or does the 2419 money continue?
Well, there's money that was in a separate bill, the funding for Shift Bustamante, and the bill itself that authorized the additional adoption, that was in legislation that has expired. Yes, it's sunsetted. The funding also has sunsetted. Both have sunsetted.
Okay. But not till 2003.
Actually, the lists were add-on lists, so the 2519 list was approved, and then they added onto the math, the old math list, and they added on to the old reading, language, arts. And the way that they determined it was math was 2003.
Mm-hmm.
So that actually expires right off January 1.
Oh, it's January.
It's
okay.
somewhat of a moot issue on math.
Okay.
Reading, language, arts is 2005, though there's 4 to 5 basic programs. This bill requires the programs to be basic. So what we're discussing are 4 or 5 basic programs on that old list. And so that's what it comes down to. The supplementals, for purposes of this law, it's very clear that it's for basic materials, and we outline for the board the definition in law of basic. So supplementals wouldn't even be included, even if there was no debate about what's on the list for basic.
The packet of materials that you're going to send us, will that include the letter that goes out to the field describing the process step by step? Is that what you're...
That letter for sure will come to you, but actually the instructions letter for the apportionments, I won't be able to send you until they get it ready for the field,
Sure.
which will be